Thanks very much, Colin. Well, as you can see, this is going to be a fairly quick, rapid sort of talk. 20 minutes. Tell me, Colin, when I get to the 20 minutes, because I know we've got issues of time here. So I'm going to talk about cities at different scales. The point I made this morning, I think, was that different groups look at cities at different scales. And, of course, the issue about defining cities is very relevant to this. I'm going to look at some particular projects we've got in CASA. They're all related to some kind of simulation, some kind of digital representation of data in this sense. So those are our coordinates, basically, and or rather our blogs, etc., which relate to this. And let me tell you what I'm going to talk about very briefly. The first point I'm going to make is that, which needs no emphasis, really, because we've said it a lot, information's changing the perception about how and what we need to understand about cities. It's actually, it's changing the nature of what we think is important in that sense. It's also changing ourselves, of course, in this sense. And, of course, part of this is to do with big data. It's also open data, too, but it's basically introducing, as I said this morning, time onto the agenda and also fine spatial scales. If you look at what we've known about cities in terms of computing and simulation over the last 30, 40 years, from the beginnings of transportation modeling in the 1950s, etc., then generally speaking, fine spatial scales have not been so much on the agenda. Short time periods, apart from peak hour in transport modeling, have not been on the agenda. Most of the work has been, you know, the next 5 years or even 50 years. But to some extent, it's the next 5 minutes, in a sense. So it's introduced time in a big way. And we'll see this in terms of some of the projects. I'm going to illustrate 5 projects. First of all, I'm going to talk about our Oyster card project. That's clearly a big data set. We've got this from Transport for London. We've got 6 months data, and it's a billion records, it's a flat file, billion records, etc. It's quite big. It can't fit in an Excel spreadsheet for obvious reasons, which is a good definition of big data. And it's introduced lots of different things that we don't really know about transportation. It's introduced us to the notion that the city is incredibly diverse, incredibly heterogeneous. Some recent work we've just done on it suggests that only 7% of these billion tap-in, tap-outs, etc., only 7% over 6 months relate to a fixed entry and exit, and then back into the entry, the same point, and then exit. So in other words, basically we can say from this data that only 7% of the data is journey to work, on the assumption we're assuming somebody taps in and then taps out and taps back in again at the end of the day, and so on. So we can filter the data in many different ways. Simpler systems, I want to quickly say something about the Public Bikes project that you can see all around you here, as indeed you can see the thing. And then I want to talk about something quite different, which changes the time scale. And this is relevant because I think Richard Dawson, who follows me, who was very central to the Tyndall Cities project, he'll tell you a little bit about that. And this is looking at how we built a land-use transport model to inform an integrated assessment of sea level rise in the Greater London area. But this was an integrated assessment that involved a whole series of models ranging from the input-output stuff that Cambridge Econometrics did, Cambridge Land Economy, through to our land-use transport model, all the way down to the GIS models done in Newcastle, and then the hydrological models, the flooding models. So that was the integrated assessment. I'll tell you briefly about that. And then big disruptions in infrastructure using the same model, the Olympics, Crossrail. We will test the location of these new airport sites that people have talked about recently. So big disruptions in infrastructure with these sorts of models typically are that. And then regional breakdown, phase transitions. I'd like to talk a little bit about defining cities. One of the things that we're doing in CASA is looking at how we define a city, and that's particularly relevant, I think, to a meeting like this. There are many, many types of definition, and we'll look at physical definition. Okay, so to race through this, that these points, generally speaking, really relate to the fact that the spatial scale is no longer the prerogative in terms of thinking about cities. It's also the temporal scale. And the other feature, of course, is that we've tended to think in terms of the knowledge, the kind of more abstract knowledge that pertains to this domain, that cities are really in equilibrium. Now, this may come as a surprise to many people, like yourselves, who come from cities from a slightly different angle from the one I come from. But generally speaking, for the last 50 years, or certainly for the last 100 years, we've thought of cities as being in equilibrium. It's not surprising we think they're in equilibrium, because they kind of look the same. It's the inertia of the built environment. But everything changes. You know, the street pattern of London, of the City of London, is essentially the 1666 street pattern. But of course, the number of changes that have taken place in the last 400 years is quite enormous. Okay, so, and the other feature, of course, is that the more we get to know about the city, the more it looks as though we're not able to predict anything that we thought we could predict. So our abilities for prediction are changing because of this increased diversity, this increased data. So I'm going to sketch a number of projects in that sense. And as I say, the tradition I'm coming from is urban economics, social physics, transportation in that sense. And I'm well aware that there are many, many other traditions that pertain, and many other scales and perspectives that pertain to cities. So this is really a kind of a temporal, this is kind of a snapshot of what we do relative to the whole domain of thinking about cities. A couple of points about big data. I've already made this point, really, that it's big because the volumes are being streamed, as it were, in real time. Not a lot of work so far in thinking about modelling in real time related to its simulation, but that is coming. These are enormous data sets in this sense, and that's changing our perspective on prediction. That 10 years ago, if you talk to town planners, certainly 20 years ago, they would never think that they had any particular focus in terms of what was happening inside of subway stations and things like that. But the whole spatial scale and temporal scale has changed in that way. And there's a general shift, I think, in a lot of this, in terms of the smart cities movement, from equity to efficiency. Efficiency and equity are the two kind of broad goals that relate, I think, to the legitimation of planning in some sense. They obviously pertain to the quality of life in some sense, and there's a continual shift in a sense between them. Okay, let me move on to the Oyster card data. Then there's a little bit of data, about 7 million tap-in, tap-outs a day, 40 million a week, 160 million a month, 1 billion for about half a year. It's big data. It pertains to the tube system, it pertains to the bus system, and it also relates to the overground railway in that sense. So it's good data in that we've got very detailed sense of how people travel over time. So we can look at a good deal of the heterogeneity in the data, but there's a lot of holes in the data too. It tells us about where people tap in and tap out. Slightly problematic, this big data set, in the sense that there are some interesting issues that the Monday I looked at about 2 years ago for a November day in, I think, 2010, maybe 3 years ago now. Anyway, this particular day I looked at, 6.2 million people tapped in, and 5.4 million people tapped out. And this was over a 24-hour period. And the missing bit was, well, a number of things. The barriers are up at the mainline station. You get fined if you are on the card, if you don't. But of course, if you're like me, you have a freedom pass, which is like a bus pass, basically. For Brits, would call it a bus pass. But it pertains to all the systems in Greater London. And from this data set, you could actually figure out how many people are actually travelling incessantly on the system. That old people, for example, may travel incessantly all day if it's free, basically. In a sense, we can actually identify this from the data. We can't identify how much money they earn. We can't identify who they are or anything like this, but we can identify this heterogeneity and routineness in travel. Okay, now, this is the system we're talking about. This is not normally the underground map. This is tube, overground, and national rail. I like to put this up because London is as complicated as Tokyo when you actually look at this particular map in this particular context. And this is a stylized map, in fact, of the various networks on which you can use the Oyster card, the RFID card. Here are some data from it, a couple of tube stations in terms of tap-in, tap-outs, etc. So we've got this dynamically changing picture every second for these In this case, I think we're looking at the overground and the tube network here, not the bus network. And there's quite a lot of stations there, probably about 500 or so in this context. We've done a little bit of work on that. There's a paper here in +1 a couple of years ago where we looked at the network, and this is the Oyster card that's in the public domain. The set we've got is specially from Transport for London, but the paper which is looking at the structure of central London, which is a really complicated structure. And then I'm not going to show you this, but if you go to this site, and this PowerPoint will be available later, and click on it, then you can actually see an animation of the flows on a daily basis. Over a week, basically, a synthesized set of flows. Okay, I will click on this one, and what we also have, so we have demand on the tube, but we also have supply, because London Transport for London make available, you can key in a command to tell you how many tube trains and where they are on the system at any point in time. There's a 3-minute latency there, so we can't really do any real-time stuff on it, but we can look at it in hindsight. So we've got actually supply of trains, and we've got people entering. In principle, we can match them up, but in practice, we can't, for the simple reason that somebody taps in. If you tap in a bank, for example, and you want to find the Waterloo City line, then it could take you 10 minutes, right? Especially if you're not actually from London and if you don't normally use that station. So the whole cognitive wayfinding thing makes it impossible for us to match up demand and supply. We can't tell if somebody enters at a certain point in time and it takes 5 minutes to get to the platform. We can't tell what train they get on, basically. So the whole disruption thing is problematic. We need more data. So stitching demand and supply is problematic. Now, I'll show you this one. This is speeded up. Okay, so that's tube trains. Now there's a glitch. You may have seen the glitch. Okay, so this is basically the tube trains on the various lines, actually, in this particular context. So this is the supply data. I had the same for the demand data, but I didn't actually show it you. Okay, we do the same with buses. This is the effect of a bus strike in East London, because we can record these things. So, to some extent, disruption has come onto the agenda in terms of these data sets. And we've done things like, this is a graph analysis of closing Liverpool Street, and interestingly enough, closing Green Park, and the black circles represent the volume of decrease, I think, and it's Green Park in the middle, and the red around the circle line represent the increases. One of the interesting features, Green Park is the station in the network that has the most betweenness centrality. It's the most accessible place. There are more shortest routes that go through Green Park than any other point in the system. It's a bit unusual, although there are some nice stories about it. It's very close to MI5 or MI6 and to Parliament and all that sort of thing. So only 3 lines go through, instead of these other stations on the Circle Line like King's Cross where you've got 7 lines. But nevertheless, it's very accessible. In fact, I came this morning on the Piccadilly line, and when it got to Green Park, a lot of people got off and a lot of people got on, which to some extent shows that it has this pivotal position. So we can do all of this with the data set. And we have done, and I'm going to race through these. Okay, the public bike system, second thing, much simpler system. We have a guy called Ollie O'Brien who has some very interesting websites. He's got 100 cities on the website, 3 years of data. Most cities that have public bike system have data online and publicly available in some senses. And if you go to his site then, and I'll take you through very quickly what he's done, you have a much simpler transport system. We have tap in and tap out, or rather taking a bike out of a dock and putting it back. We have that data. We don't have the shortest route data. Big problem, because you take a bike out of a dock and you ride it around for half an hour free and you put it back in, then, you know, we have a record of it, but we don't know where people have gone, basically, at that point. And one of the features is that the first half hour is free. So here's his website, Global View. And this is the London website. So this is updated in real time, and you can click on these things. The red represent probably plus, as it were, in the dock, and the blue represent empties basically, and you can see a shift over the day. In the mornings around the mainline stations around the centre, you have a large supply of bikes, and they're taken out and driven into the city and into the West End somewhere. It's a relatively simple pattern, and the data in fact is relatively simple in that sense, much simpler than the Oyster card data, but nevertheless we really need to think about what we can do with this. We can look at patterns of occupation, but to get anything really from it, we need to probably stitch it together with other modes of transport that in principle we might be able to do. So here's a few things about the bike scheme. Just going to whip through these. Okay. And then there's obviously apps for the bikes and all of that kind of thing. And it's been extended. You can see the extension into Canary Wharf, which is London's second CBD. And then we've done a variety of visualizations with it. Some visualizations of this sort using shortest routes type things. So we've done some basic analysis of it, and there are some animations, etc. But generally speaking, and we're looking at patterns between different places in that sense to try and make sense of how people are using these schemes. Okay, now, long and short-term flooding, the Tyndall Cities project. This is my third example. We've been involved in a large consortium project led by Newcastle Civil Engineering, where Richard Dawson is a professor, and we've looked at the integrated assessment of climate change in Greater London. So essentially this is the integrated assessment. The Moses model is built by Leeds Geography, which is a microsimulation model of the UK economy, demographic, which we've plugged in at various points. As the demographic side, the UK input-output model is built by Cambridge Econometrics. That's a spin-off from Cambridge University Land Economy. The land use transport model in the middle there is what we've built. So this is a scaling down of long-term employment and population projections for the Greater London region. And we're in the business of allocating those using the land use transport model. It feeds into the population site model, which is a GIS thing, taking it downscale, and Newcastle Geomatics, Civil Engineering have done that. And the flooding models, the hydrological models, come in with Richard's work and Jim Hall's work in this particular context to actually show what would happen. We're predicting population under certain scenarios, and we're then sort of looking at the flooding implications in this. And generally speaking, there are quite severe flooding events, as it were, quite severe flooding problems in the as you head out towards the east into the estuary. All of these are informed by broad level predictions from the IPCC, the global climate change models that suggest that the North Sea might rise by a metre over the next 100 years, etc. If the Greenland ice cap melted, then probably be all right here, but most of the South Bank would be actually flooded in that sense. So there are some quite severe possibilities. Of course, on the way to these events, then there'd be a lot of adaptation and mitigation and so on. Okay, we've built a land use transport model which runs on the desktop, makes use of things like Google Maps. As you run it in real time, Google Earth, etc., we can build it. It's a particular interface showing with a certain amount of simple GIS functionality built from scratch, but it accesses other non-proprietary software such as Google Earth in that context. And we've also looked in a different project at flooding events. If I click on this, this is from our 3D model that we built a few years ago. And this is what happens if the Greenland ice cap does melt. The little oval bit at the bottom here is the GLA. That's the Norman Foster building. That little kind of oyster-looking building. Building, and of course, it's interesting that it's interesting to ask the question: why did they not build on that for the last 2,000 years? It looks as though it floods, basically. The Tower of London has flooded, etc. So you can see that you get to a 4-metre rise in sea level, and most of South London is actually flooded. Okay, we also looked at things like with accessibility. What happens if you close all the bridges, all the bridges up until Hammersmith Bridge, basically, then the shift in traffic or accessibility in this particular context is done in this particular way. And we've looked at big disruptions in infrastructure. This is the Again, the same model, the same land use transport model. This is accessibility. You can see the lines of the tubes marked out here in terms of access. Red meaning high accessibility, blue low. The reason why you've got this blue in the centre is because of congestion charging. There's the Olympic Games site. And we've looked at trying to inject population and jobs into East London and see what happens. And invariably what happens is that you get local spillover effects, okay, in this sense. But generally speaking, the drift is out of East London towards the west because it's much more attractive, the west, relatively speaking. The east has always been massively deprived. So the big issue in regeneration in East London is to just pump in a certain amount of investment that will multiply itself in a way. An airport might do it in some sense, but again, largely because people can travel so quickly and so fast these days, some of these impacts are different. Okay, so we've done quite a bit of work on that, and we've also looked at Crossrail. This is this high-speed railway which will take you from Heathrow to Stratford. I think originally it was planned to open for the Olympic Games, but it's not. It's delayed, of course. It's been on the drawing board for 50 years. But they are building it. I don't think you can say anything particularly around here. You've got Tottenham Court Road and Bond Street, and they're digging away, tunnelling through. And it should be a very fast railway once it starts. I suspect we won't be able to use our free bus passes on it. It'll be like the Heathrow Express, right, sort of owned by some company making money. Okay, regional breakdown. The last thing I want to talk about is defining cities, and Elsa, who is one of our lecturers in CASA, is responsible for this project, along with myself. And we're interested in defining cities because potentially we're interested in this general question that Lewis Betancourt and Jeff West have examined, which is to do with the allometry of city sizes. As cities get bigger, they get more prosperous. I said this morning that in the last 100 years, people have thought the opposite. Big cities are not nice places to live, so push people out to the suburbs and the countryside, etc. But the wheel has turned, and people think big cities are now more prosperous. And Jeff and Lewis have demonstrated that this is certainly the case in terms of their data for the United States. Our take on this is that it really depends on what you define a city in this particular context. So what they're showing is that in the United States, for the MSAs, that as cities get bigger, the pace of life gets faster, congestion and crime get greater, they scale superlinearly, and income and patents and inventions scale superlinearly, and things such as physical things such as utilities and roads, etc., scale sublinearly. So it looks like big cities, you just get generally a better deal, okay, in that sense, although, of course, crime and congestion get greater as well. Now, we've actually looked at this in the UK, in a sense, and this is a picture of accessibility in Britain. It's not a picture of income, so we plotted a graph here of population versus accessibility, and you can see effectively how polarised London is in this particular picture. And what we've begun to do is to define a city by actually thinking of this as a network where you have percolation in this particular context. So what we essentially do is we decrease the distance threshold. We have a map, a big data map of the entire UK from Ordnance Survey or OpenStreetMap with many, many links. This is the entire road system. We're talking about roads here. Basically digitized, etc. And we basically put a threshold on it for defining what's near to what. And as we actually as we decrease that threshold, then the more clustered places defined on roads begin to come out. So this is one way of looking at the definition of cities, simply based on accessibility in that sense. So I'm actually decreasing the threshold at this point, in a sense, and I've decreased it a number of orders, and that's rather interesting because that split, and I'm plotting the top 10 clusters at this point, that split between Scotland and the rest of Britain is quite amusing because it sort of says, well, maybe after all the Scots are right, maybe they should devolve and set their own nation. But it's very interesting because that split is across the sort of
the central lowlands of Scotland, it is an interesting question as to why things have not developed there. It probably is historical and cultural in some senses. Anyway, as we actually relax in this sense, then the Lake District and Snowdonia come out. That's the green and the red there. But and then we're getting a little bit round the Wash. Interestingly enough, that yellow bit, I've been to most places in Britain, but I've never been to Lincoln. I've never been to Hull. And that's the kind of area that, in a sense, is quite remote in a way. And as we begin to cluster things, you can see basically that at this particular point the southeast cuts off from the rest of urban England and Wales in this particular context. And to some extent, this is a very interesting question because largely we assume that the blue bit is essentially the city. We've really got to look at all of that to make sense of what's going on in this part of the world. The other question, of course, is do we have to think about the red and the blue together? Is it meaningful to actually break things out in this sense? Now, okay, and we go down in that particular way. Okay, now I've illustrated a number of different projects that pertain to spatial scale and temporal scale, all of which are informed by digital data and the kind of tools that we use in a sense. They don't say an awful lot about some of the issues we're talking about, the supportive city, the personalized city and so on, although you can begin to see how some of these tools might inform a debate obviously with policymakers, planners and other stakeholders who have a professional and vested interest, but also with citizens at large, certainly with respect to what we might learn from the smaller scale, the finer scale, and finer scale temporal projects such as the transport projects. Okay, now we've written a number of papers on this. There are some papers that relate to each of these projects that we've written, and we will post this PowerPoint basically or PDF so people can get access to it. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
How do you define, are you looking at the intersection between roads, or how did you define the sort of...
Yeah, I'm just going to put it up. Okay, yeah.
What makes, is it the density of roads, or is it the intersection between roads?
Elsa. I think it is more or less what you implied. I couldn't give quite a coherent definition as Elsa because it's not, strictly speaking, a simple distance thing. It's a bit more than that. I should also credit Pete Ferguson, who used to work for Space Syntax. There's some Space Syntax people in the room, right? Sort of. This wasn't quite a space syntax, but it's not far off, basically, in that sense. But anyway, it's a distance threshold that connects near roads together. It's quite a fine scale threshold. When we're talking about this, then I think we're talking about I don't know how the scale goes down, but we're talking here about the red cluster is separated from these other clusters, and the threshold there is about 1 kilometre, something like that. 5 kilometres. 5 kilometres right at the top, and then as we get down finer and finer, then it gets a bit smaller.
Michael, do these models inform policymakers and elected officials, or is this more of an academic exercise?
Okay. Well.
And second half of the question.
Okay, go on.
If they do inform policymakers, or even if they don't, what kind of ethical framework would you use before releasing information of that complexity and impact?
Yeah, okay, so the first two projects, the Oyster card project is very much a collaboration with Transport for London. I won't tell you how we got this. Well, I will tell you how we got this collaboration because it's the idiosyncrasies of life. I mean, John Reeds, who runs the Oyster card project,
went to Princeton and did comparative literature, and when he came to UCL to do his PhD, he then found that his colleague who had also done comparative literature was head of Oyster card development, or number 3 in Oyster card development at that point. So, but Transport for London are very good at releasing the data. Lots of checks. We can't give you that data, but we can. If you go to Transport for London, you can probably get it. They're very open in this particular context. So, and that project has, to the extent that Transport for London have changed what they do on the basis of what we've done. In the first project, which is just, well, I showed you getting to know, then there's nothing there. But somebody once asked us in UCL whether they'd actually changed the ticketing arrangements. And I said, no. Transport for London are a multi-million or multi-billion pound operation, and they use consultants like Arabs and so on to actually, do the work. They're not going to ask us to do that. But we have looked at the Olympic Games. What happened over the period of the Olympic Games? And we want, because the big thing was that London would melt down during the Olympic Games. It didn't. So we have looked at some adaptation, and we've had some interesting discussions with Transport for London, with people who operate these systems about it. So in that very general sense, yes, we've had a little bit of impact. Now, on the bikes project, we've not really had any impact at all with any stakeholders of any sorts. It's a bit more difficult to pin them down, who are the stakeholders in the bikes project. I'm not sure we would want to talk to Barclays Bank, who seem to finance it, but nevertheless. Now, on the third project, the Tyndall Cities project, Tyndall was the British academic response to climate change, the Tyndall Centre, and we embedded that project entirely within a set of stakeholders, the Environment Agency. Now, by stakeholders, we mean people, to some extent, not that dissimilar from ourselves, because they're policy analysts, but Environment Agency, DCLG, which is the equivalent of HUD in the United States, obviously Transport for London, and a variety of other bodies in London who've been involved in that. Now, Richard, are you going to say something about that at all?
I was going to, yes. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so we can pick up on that because it is very strongly embedded in a stakeholder context, with a view that the climate plan for London, the climate officer was probably, they set up the scenarios we tested in that. In the last project is very much blue skies, although there's a lot of interest by DCLG, which is the Environment Agency, which is the Housing and Urban Development Agency here. There's a lot of interest in this prosperity question within Britain. So, because of course the big issue is, does one try and revive the northern cities? That's been on the agenda for 100 years, basically. I mean, since the decline of big coal and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, there is some loose policy context at that. Now, I can't remember. What was my fourth project? What have I missed out? Doesn't really matter. But the point is that, yes, we are... Now, you asked the question about the data we've got. Most of this stuff is produced in academic papers or in dialogue and discussion reports, etc. Most of what we've got is, most of what we're using is pretty much checked for privacy and confidentiality. We have not been given any data that we could stitch together and produce sensitive things from, although that's an issue that is a moving target, that it's not out of the question that we could link some data sets together and add a bit of value which would identify certain individuals. Although there is some control by the data agencies who handle this, a lot of control in that sense. So I wouldn't like to give a kind of carte blanche about these things are completely protected in that sense. But generally speaking, there are quite strict controls. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a great example of kinds of things that we're going to be able to do with big data, but also some of the questions that it can't answer as well.